just to, I mean, I will not take much time, but just to sort of set the context, so children's literature in India has changed hugely since I was a child, since maybe all of us, well, definitely Sayoni and I were children. But I mean, I think we still have too many books that sort of look at children in a kind of instrumentalist way as empty vessels that have to be filled with virtues that, should be instructed. But I think, especially in the last 2 decades, we've had some really wonderful books which have come from a place of deep respect for children and for the lived experiences of childhood. And I think today we have 3 exemplary representatives from the world of children's literature. Kanato, our youngest participant, he's an illustrator and art director with Pratham. And I think his work is sort of, I've seen some of your work on Story Weaver, and I think it's sort of redrawing the way children are drawn. And hopefully, the kids who are reading those books, we will see in their artwork different kinds of children with different kinds of features being drawn. So it's really nice to have you here. And then we have Siddharth, who is a journalist, a researcher, a writer. Most recent book is Year of the Weeds. And Siddharth's work reflects a really wonderful eye for detail and very rigorous research. And then we have the primary platypus of Duckbill Books, Sayoni Basu. Duckbill is a publisher that is really engaged, I think, with the idea of diversity. They've taken up some really challenging themes, and they've also, I think, engaged with the idea of diversity by trying to include new and different kinds of voices in the whole process of creating children's books. So welcome, everybody. And let's talk a little bit about diversity and how contemporary Indian children's literature is making room for this complex diversity that we have in this country and how dignity has a place in it. So maybe we should begin first by talking about what does it mean to create room for diversity? Is it about having more stories from places and communities that have not found representation so far, or is it more? Is it also about, choices of form and who's writing it, who's telling those stories? So should we begin with you, Siddharth?
I think the first thing is to decide what kind of stories are worth telling. So it begins from a choice of narrative, which is a choice that anybody dealing in fiction or even non-fiction would make. And then perhaps whether the community is underrepresented or not. Because there might be underrepresented communities, but their stories might not be as compelling as other communities. So the first choice is always, I guess, one of the literary merit of the story. But usually, especially in a country as complex as India, and especially not just because it's complex, but also because most communities in India are not represented. So this is an easy choice because there are so many compelling stories from so many parts of the country, and geography is not even a factor because when we talk about the word remote, for instance, ordinarily, at least the dictionary meaning mostly has to do with distance. But in India, geographical distance does not mean remoteness because there are remote communities near prominent urban centers. So there are a lot of these stories which can be told from all these communities. The first choice is the quality of the story, and then whether those communities are underrepresented or not. But the most difficult choice is how far should a writer who is not from that group go in order to tell the story? Because there's a very thin line between talking about lived experiences and appropriating those voices. And that's the most difficult choice for a writer, and I think that's the one area where a writer should spend the most time on.
We'll come back and talk a little bit more about this in the context of Year of the Weeds, yeah? Sayoni, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I agree completely with Siddharth that in any choices that one makes for publishing, it's the literary merit of the story, which is always of paramount importance. And possibly not even literary merit, just the story itself. Because language is important, but language is something that one can work with. The thing is, there are so many different kinds of diversities in our country that it's an impossible task. One is that one does not want to publish programmatically. You don't want to say that we don't have enough stories from, the Bhil communities of Rajasthan, and therefore let us find one. You cannot find stories that way. Some author has to feel sufficiently inspired by a story. And again, often the dilemmas which are represented in a story, the dilemmas which make a story compelling to read, are something which move between communities. I mean, the essential challenges. So in that sense, representation can also mean representation of the particular crisis rather than a particular representation of everyday life situations. Secondly, most people in the children's publishing community are very noble. Okay, so we want to do the correct thing. Unfortunately, we often end up doing the correct thing in a slightly blundering fashion. It's not that there are not enough picture books featuring kids from often unlocalized but still rural backgrounds, because we in our wisdom feel that there should be more. But it's often that the way that it's done is somewhat ham-handed and clumsy, and it ends up building stereotypes of rural life. All life is very particular, right? While it's also very universal, it's also very localized and particular. We have, especially in English language books in India, partly because it's not something that one can live off, a vast majority of the writers are very middle class, middle-aged often, urban
Who have
women.
other ways
Yeah.
of earning money.
Who have other ways of earning money or don't need to earn money. So they write from a particular worldview. And I can't tell you the number of manuscripts we receive which are set in, buildings in unnamed or unspecified metropolises. And the crises are... So, I mean, when I got the subject of this email, this conversation, I was as confused as I am now, which is that I don't really know where to begin. So all we end up doing is, yes, we actively look for stories. We find people who may or may not be writers, or certainly are not writers, for children, and ask them, do you have a story to tell? As publishers, that is about the extent of what we can do. And yes, when we are reading manuscripts, if it's a manuscript from in an unusual setting, somewhere in our reading experiences, without our being conscious of it, it gets additional brownie points. But again, it all goes back to what kind of a story is it.
How good the story is, yeah. Okay, so Kanatu, let's look at it from your practice, yeah, from the image. I saw that there's that lovely little story called Snip, which is, it's wordless, right?
Yes.
So it's a picture book without words. And what I really liked about it is it's about an everyday kind of childhood experience, which many children across cultures would may have experimented with. And yet, for the first time, I'm seeing it set in a setting which is not Delhi or Bombay or Bangalore. Yeah? So can you tell us a little bit about that?
All right. So in connection with what we've been talking, I completely agree with our two speakers as well. I think the first thing that comes is a good story. So sometimes when you're trying to, talk about diversity, we tend to just bring in people, and since he or she is from a particular group of, a particular place, or so that we just get a story from them. And I think maybe that in a way we are already making the mistake of, tokenism, just bringing somebody there because we need to represent, even though there is no story or there is no, let's say, talent. But anyway, so coming with Snip, this was a part of my project, graduation project that I did with Pratham Books, and I specifically wanted to work on diversity, and specifically with where I am from. And that is how I started working on this story about, and did a little research on how many books are there. Since I am from Nagaland, I was trying to see like how many books are there, not just Nagaland, but Northeast. And I did find there are a lot of books out there, but then I think 80% were folk tales or folklores, which is great. I mean, they are beautiful folk tales and folklores, which should be shared with the world. But I also realized that that's how we have been boxed. You're always looking from the perspective of folk tales and folklores, that people tend to look at you. For example, when I first joined the work, that was the thing that they told me about. And which is, I mean, folk tales are great, but then I would not want to box myself to this. We have other stories as well. For example, we have...
And you have contemporary life as well.
Right. And we also I have a lot of friends who have settled here in Delhi, and I'm sure they will also have their stories as well, with their children, studying with others here. It's completely a different experience than people like me who studied back home in Nagaland. And so I'm saying, so I wanted to do something that was based on lived realities. And at one point, I realized that I was thinking too much. Like, I was trying to talk about diversity and how representation, sometimes it gets to your head. And then I realized, no, I'm just going to tell a story authentically, genuinely, something that maybe comes from my memory, from something that I can just tell a story about, something from my heart. And that's how I tried to pick a subject that was relatable and universal. So Snip is actually about haircut. So these two siblings, they go and they find a pair of scissors, so they cut their hair, and they realized that it was a mess, and they were trying to hide it from their parents. And so it's the adventure of these two kids, which I think is relatable to me as much as it would be, even if somebody from, let's say, Switzerland is reading it. Yeah. So that's the universality, the relatability. But at the same time, I also, because I am telling the story, I wanted not thinking so much about, okay, should it be, from the perspective of diversity, like, should it be set properly here? I was thinking so much about it, but then I realized that I shouldn't. And I wanted to, going back to my memories, I thought I'll set it in a place where I was familiar with. Right. And that kind of became the backdrop of it. So the story, I feel, I wanted it to be universal, the idea to be universal, but at the same time, the way it was visualized, the way I was as an illustrator also, I wanted to make sure that it was authentic. Like it was...
particular.
Yes, yeah. From where I was and how it was in my head. And in doing that, I also, after the book was out, I also shared with children. And actually, it didn't matter.
Exactly.
Once they talk about like cutting the hair, they started sharing about their experiences as well. And I think that's a nice space also to start talking about, when we talk about diversity, bringing in the familiar and the unfamiliar as well. And if there is something unfamiliar, I think that is where we can start conversations, and that's how I try to approach the book. And hopefully, as it goes out, at least it will, start some conversation.
Yeah, but that is what I think is the value of that the particular is in the unsaid. It's for us to sort of experience it as we look at the pages, no? That's true, yeah. So, yeah. So maybe this is a good time to come back to you, Siddharth, and to talk about this idea of, like, the insider-outsider binary, and when you are writing on behalf, like, where does it become appropriation in that sense? And what are the challenges when you are writing about something that is not you, you know? And should one not try it? And if you do, then what are the challenges?
Specifically for the recent novel Year of the Weeds, which is based on real events. It's centered around the Niyamgiri agitation in Odisha, in southern Odisha. I have changed the location of the events and the community, but not the metal, the ore, because I thought that was very significant and that shouldn't change. Apart from that, as I was writing it, I started including a lot of issues such as the failures of the Indian state, district administrations, the judiciary, police system, all of which are problems that almost everyone in India faces, except a certain section of society. And these are universal problems in the country. So it became a story of the country as a whole and not just a specific community. As far as appropriating voices is concerned, I tried to tell the story from the perspective of specific characters. So when I was telling it from their perspective, I made sure that it would be as authentic to their experience as possible.
So how do you do that?
I used to be a reporter. So when I used to, mostly I covered conflict, but sometimes I covered other issues as well. So whenever I reported from the field, I tried to tell the stories from the eyewitnesses' viewpoints. So I have had some practice in not inserting myself into my stories, and I think that has helped in this way. It is certainly very attractive. When you are telling especially a story of 60 or 70,000 words, it's very attractive to let go, and you have created a character, you spent a lot of effort in creating a certain character, and you have placed them in a certain geography, a certain time, a certain ethnicity and culture. And then you start putting yourself in it. It's very attractive. It's also very insidious, but one has to be conscious all the time that the voice should be accurate. It should not sound fake. And well, there is no objective criterion for judging this, but a reader, an observant reader, would understand where fakery has stepped in, even if it is disguised very well. Also, appropriation happens in other ways. For instance, a writer might be so engaged with the story or with the community about which she is writing that she feels a certain paternalistic approach towards them, and therefore she might say that, oh, look at them, they are the noble savage, you know. And that has happened for a long time. Writing about marginalized communities is not new. It has been, people have been writing about them for a while. At least for the last 150 odd years. But for most of this period, especially from liberal writers, there was a certain paternalistic approach. So there was an appropriation. There
Orientalism type of.
Exactly, which Orientalism began from there.
Yeah.
Which is the other extreme from your bigoted, racist, xenophobic kind of writing. Yeah. And that is equally something to be careful about, especially in fiction. In non-fiction, there is a certain degree of objectivity involved anyway, but in fiction, that certainly needs to be encountered, and if encountered, it's a process that I suppose any writer would go through. She should continue to have conversations with herself and see, am I appropriating it? Am I being paternalistic towards them? Am I letting my characters do the thing, or am I acting like a puppeteer? Yeah. So this is a continuous process.
So there is no escape from constantly asking yourself the question, and also research, right?
Yes, certainly, research, yes.
That is what is needed. I would imagine that some of these things that we're talking about, these are, they are not actually restricted only to children's literature. We can see how these are actually issues that come up with any kind of work for adults or for children. So there's something to be thought about in how we approach these spaces and these sorts of issues. And I would imagine that it is something that becomes all the more critical for English language publishing, right? Yeah. That because you want stories, because we are the kind of country that we are, and you want the plurality of stories, But this tricky thing, this, the voice, how do you, find that right voice which is not appropriating and yet, I mean, I'm a bit wary of using the word authentic because what is authentic? That is another thing. So when you get manuscripts, like what are the antenna that you have? And
It's surprisingly easy to spot. I mean, obviously the appropriation angle you need to read further, but as soon as you start reading, the one thing, if someone is writing, presumably, I mean, see, when we start reading manuscripts, we just open the file and start reading. So you don't actually even look at the author's name and think about, oh, where is this person from? You just read. But the one thing which shines through immediately is whether the person knows the world or not. So it's like, right, even in a fantasy novel, for example. When you're reading a fantasy novel, completely imaginary, nothing to do with reality at all, but you know instantly whether the world feels real or not. It's the same with, well, it's the same with any fiction set anywhere. Even a Delhi person writing a Delhi novel might not be able to create the world just because they don't have the ability to do it. But yes, obviously when it's talking about a setting which is unfamiliar to me, it becomes, that bit is very, very easy to spot. One of the things which is kind of related to this is, sometime back we published a story which was set in Madhya Pradesh, which was about a Bombay-based family of presumably, I think, Gujarati origin. One of the things we like in our books, and we do not italicize words which do not exist in English, but also one of the things we like is when people don't use Hindi words as a kind of default to, it doesn't have to be chacha, or, well, actually chacha exists in various languages, but whatever, bua. So this particular character had an aunt who was originally called bua, but we kind of quizzed the author and said, what are the Gujarati terms which would be used for these relationships? A lot of them were common with what the Hindi terms were, but one of the things was fui, which is aunt. So we said, what is she more likely to say? It was actually not that significant in the whole process of discussion. It was part of something else. After we published the book, we surprisingly got a fair bit of resistance to the fui. From readers. People would write in and say, why don't you have a glossary? Why have you not used bua or whatever? And which is where I also think that, on the one hand, we are talking about the need for diverse books. And clearly, 3 people writing does not constitute even 1% of our readership. But the fact that people read one unfamiliar word and show resistance to it also suggests that the diversity which we theoretically think we need in books might often be something which we as creators are looking at more than people who are reading it. And I think until
But that's
people
a very sad thought.
Yeah, until people who are reading it also genuinely want to read about people unlike them, apart from folk tales, which everybody must read. We also won't have more people writing, because somewhere what one reads influences the kind of stories one wants to tell.
So, but this resistance must have come from grown-ups.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So maybe then the thing is that, it's a little bit of chicken and egg, but that,
Children never resist.
right? So
Yeah.
you put out, as writers and illustrators, if one were to keep putting out stuff, and as publishers you keep pushing that,
Yeah.
that's one way of kind of...
Well, as publishers, so this sounds terribly imperialistic almost. But honestly, as publishers, we think of what books we like.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you start thinking of what the market wants, then you end up publishing crap.
So which is actually what you said, that you just thought then of what you would like to write about, to draw about, the story that you want to say from the what was familiar to you. So in that sense, you can't always be thinking about that imagined readership, no?
Yeah, that's definitely true. Yeah, and with regard to yeah, how it goes to the market and how they respond to it, we don't really get. For me, I work basically in the picture book, and so we try our best, but then we don't really put the parents in our heads. Like when we are doing it,
Good.
it's mostly the even not children. I mean, it's just trying to create good books. So at the end, whether they like it or not, or maybe it's bad, but maybe it's for them, but then it could work for someone else. So
And you
yeah,
just hope that it works for a larger audience, a larger readership, as larger
right,
readership as
right, right.
possible.
And yeah, I think the more we create this, I think it's going to go out more, and maybe there'll be some resistance now, but hopefully, like as we keep telling more stories from diverse, from different, as we keep making and writing and making more books and um, visuals, I think it will eventually, hopefully, yeah, uh,
Make a change.
yeah, make a change, especially when we talk about diversity. Yeah.
Yeah. So the other thing is, I mean, like you all have said, that in a way, diversity is also, it's like a little bit of a buzzword, no? And so are we getting stories from here and this community, and is everybody getting a voice and a space? That's sort of like a default understanding of diversity. Um, the challenge then also becomes the other theme, which is of the theme in this panel, the idea of dignity. No, that what is the place then for something like that? That how do we inform our approaches and perspectives in the creation of such books when this overarching theme of diversity is there? Which of you would like to take a go at that?
Dignity. So let's take a kind of lived experience. For instance, poverty. You're writing about a character who is clearly poor. Um, well, the first thing is none of us has a real idea of what poverty is. We have a theoretical idea. Some of us, like me, who've reported from the ground, have seen it. That's at best secondhand. Uh, Poverty means many things to so many different people. One way of showing it in a dignified manner, in other words, well, I think in this case, dignity would mean giving agency to the character. Um, One way of doing it is not by theoretically saying, oh, she didn't have money, or oh, she was hungry. Just show her going through her life, and perhaps for a perceptive reader, by showing the things that are absent from her life because of poverty. This is an absence of material possessions. This is an absence of opportunities, of education, healthcare, everything. If you show her doing it, rather than going into this long exposition, that is one way of giving her agency while presenting her life through her eyes. That, I think, is one way. I'm sure there are a lot of other ways, but that's one way that I have found works as far as my writing goes. Um, Dignity comes from allowing the character to live her life and see her life the way she lives it, rather than telling her story through your own voice. So I think dignity would come from less exposition and more just letting her life she seep through. Uh, I don't know if that answers you.
Yeah. No, I understand. I understand what you're saying. So one part of it is to give the character agency, and then the other is also, like what parts of the character's life are we seeing? So as an illustrator, then how do you kind of like, how do we see that everyday life, and that there may be that the character may be poor, but there may be in the inner world of the character, there are things which may be common with a character who's not poor, so that then the image then also becomes that much more important in the storytelling, no? Because then you are communicating things which are maybe not told but shown.
Right. In this regard, I want to share about a story that just came out on Story Weaver, Pratham Books. It's called Anand, and it's about
Called
this Anand. So this guy, he's a rag picker. So he goes around collecting rubbish from home to home. But then it has been visualized in such a way, it has been beautifully illustrated by Raja Vibe, and it has been done in such a way that you see the world from this guy's eyes. And the fun he is having throughout his day, and his friends, the little children, there's a little boy that he's friend with, and also, the way he goes through his life, the music that he listens to, and the fun he is going through. And there is, in no way we're talking about what he does or where he is from. It's just a picture of his everyday life, And in that we are not really talking about what this guy does or what his social status is, but we are getting a very good glimpse of, a piece of his life. But it's beautifully illustrated, and it just brings the book alive. And I think that's the way we should also be approaching a lot of as picture book makers, as illustrators. That's one way we can also approach, bringing those stories to life that way. Yeah.
So we see that in Korok, no? Like, not only does he have agency in the big narrative of the protest and all that, but it's in the small things, like how he's thinking about the cake. Those are also ways in which you communicate, that the character has a sense of himself or herself. So in some ways, then we are coming back to this question of literary and artistic merit, about craft and skill. So how can we, and as publishers who have tried to widen the sort of net of, who's writing children's books, how can we find and what is needed to be able to actually get these kinds of stories, but have the stories told, not in that tokenistic way that you all spoke of, but, as good stories, good storytelling, but from so many different spaces and voices.
It's a very difficult question. We really luck out in the manuscripts that come to us. That is the honest truth. I want to talk very briefly about two books we published, both first novels. Where I was thinking about these when we were talking about dignity. One was a book called Unbroken, which is a teen novel by a writer called Nandika Nambi. Last year it won both the Hindu and Crossword Children's List. It's about a girl who is disabled. She's in a wheelchair. And when, as I said, when we read the manuscripts, we don't really look at the person's name, we just read the manuscript. So we read the manuscript, and it talks very vividly. I mean, it talks about a lot of things. She's a very angry girl, but it also talks about the physicality of her life. The difficulties of being in a wheelchair, the difficulty of being really sweaty and not being able to have a bath, the problems in going to the bathroom. And she talks about it in great detail, and the difficulties in moving around in the wheelchair. I mean, in very specific, I turned it this way, and then so I have to say that when I finished reading the manuscript, I was convinced that Nandika herself was in a wheelchair, because there was such enormous detailing and understanding of the physicality of the book is very, very strong. She isn't, but it really stunned me that this young woman, she's also a very young writer, just got into her character so well. So as I said, we've lucked out because these manuscripts have landed up. But I think that somewhere people are becoming slowly aware that different kinds of stories work. There is still far and wide a notion that children's books have a certain kind of story in them. One poor unfortunate journalist from the Hindu sent me an interview, list of questions for an interview yesterday, where one of the questions was that now the children's books are less candy floss, do you find this reflected in the cover? Poor thing got, 500 words of angry response. But that is it. I mean, this is a woman who is writing about children's books, and her main impression, for the Hindu Literary Review no less, and her main impression of children's books is that it's candy floss. So I think people are becoming, despite this prevailing view, people are becoming aware that different kinds of stories are being told. And as soon as people know that there is a chance that such books will be published, I think people will write more. And I think over the last 10 years, you know, something like this, where we are talking to a forum of people who are not, whose first interest is not children's writing. You know, so you are talking to more diverse audiences, and I think the more diverse kinds of people write, and here I'm talking about diverse interests, not just, the more different kinds of stories we'll get.
So maybe this is a good point to ask the audience if there are questions they would like to ask of our speakers.
Before that, I also had a question for Kanato. I've admired your works. I've seen them on Story Weaver. Could you tell us a bit about the influences that have gone into the specific, the form and the stylistic choices that you make in your art? What are your influences in there?
That's as in the book, or generally in my
Your
my
art.
Okay, generally. So, well, I would say the style that I have, it came organically because I wasn't formally trained as well. I'm also a self-taught illustrator, so I used to keep illustrating. But initially, when I started drawing, I had this a lot of this burden, you know, you have, like when you are from a certain place, you get used to being always exoticized, that you also start thinking it's, I have to show the world, you also, as much as people look at you, you also take that as a reality. So there was one phase where I was like, oh, we have this beautiful culture, or we have this beautiful attire, so I'll start drawing them and show it to the world. That sort of burden also, and also this trying to please people, and playing with the exoticizing thing as well. But in doing that, now that I look back, maybe it wasn't, the intention wasn't really in the right place, but it had made me evolve as an illustrator now. But then as I keep doing the stories, and as also with these books, the first book that I did was for already, the script was already there, and I had to do a research and work on it. The second one that I had to, it became a wordless book, but it was, the idea, the concept, and the illustrations were all mine. So I was trying to see like how I can authentically, from my heart, like, genuinely do.
Authentic to you.
Yeah, authentic
That's
to me. So do it. So I did not want to start creating something new, like something that is not me. And that was also one struggle that I was also having. So when I was trying to see like what would work, some styles I would look and I really admire, but it wasn't me. And so something that came out organically. But one thing is, I, as much as possible, I try to put in that, for example, in snip. So the things, the setting, I know exactly what I am going to put in this place, because the book moves from it shows a lot of the home that they live in, the space that they have, the outdoors, and so for me it was already in my head, and there's so much influence from where I am from. So in that way, style is there, but then it's mostly from what the visual, what would I say, bank that I have in my head. I think I draw from there in all the illustrations that I do. Yeah.
We are talking about expressing diversity with dignity, and you're expressing diversity to people who are outside of, let's say, that community, right? But at the same time, when we produce any kind of work, we want that diversity to be spoken within the community as well, right? So in that sense, as a publisher or as a creative writer or an illustrator, how do we achieve that penetration? This is, or what are the different avenues to penetrate even that marginalized population who might be illiterate, who might not be able to read, but at the same time there are partially literate people as well. So how do we reach that? This is coming from a place where there are a lot of us, my friends are also writers, and we have actually discussed about slow journalism, or we have discussed about, okay, I'm talking about forest rise, but it is still relevant to a kid or an adult in that population, and I don't know how to reach there. And anywhere you go, people talk about target audience and marketing. So how do you go beyond that? That's the kind of question. What are the different avenues to penetrate? I think the second one is around an observation that you were talking about, Fui and Bua. I don't know, I could be wrong in this, but so probably it's, right now there's a lot more exposure than before, right? And for all you know, even as kids, I have lived in Bombay, so I felt this, that the kids even from Gujarat, they are very used to this cosmopolitan language. Probably they don't even follow that Fui thing sometimes. And in a way, these kind of feedback that we get on a book is probably showing this change within population as to how they are accepting more common terms than traditional terms, for example.
Getting books to people who don't have access to them is what everybody in the publishing and library movements are working on. I think things are improving now in the sense that it still, drops in the ocean, but that's how everything starts. I think the library movement is actually getting slowly and infinitesimally, but it's getting stronger. So I think there is more access in that, and I think what people like Pratham are doing, where they're doing library sets which you can buy for a certain amount and the smallest school can have them, is again a step in the right direction. Some of the state governments are now buying books for state government libraries. Used to be like one of the biggest unspoken scams in India. But now a couple of states, Bihar and Delhi, for example, are actually giving more power to school librarians and bringing a whole range of publishers to their attention so that they can pick. So as I said, things are happening slowly and in very, very few places, but they are happening. And that is really about it, sadly. We don't know where books go because there are so many cities in India where there are no bookshops. Or there are just bookshops which sell textbooks and maybe, strangely, some Geronimo Stilton. But in which way the online sales have been a boon, but again, online purchase limits it to very few people. Having said which, I think in some states at least, I don't know about all of them, for example, in Bengal, the Bengali publishers have very, very strong networks of distribution where even the smallest towns have access. I know more about Bengal because I'm from there, so, and I'm sure that that is replicated in other language areas as well. What you spoke about in terms of the Fui and Bua, it is true that language is changing. It is also true that a Hindi-dominant Bollywood culture is permeating and changing the way that many of us have lived. I'll go back to Bengal. We never had Karwa Chauth when I was growing up. Now suddenly around Karwa Chauth, I find friends and neighbors are all holding up dishes. But while that is true, and maybe if we were truly representing, but nothing is ever a true representation. Every representation is subjective, so we will damn well put the Fui in, and they'd better figure out what it means.
Yeah, so with regard to your first question, I think as our speaker has also mentioned, since I work at Pratham Books, sometimes we have this, the people that the books have reached out to, sometimes they come back with maybe an Instagram post or from someone else, or maybe a mail, and then they send pictures of children reading them, and it just, we're filled with joy. Because we can't really trace where they go, but sometimes when it comes back to us and they share their stories with us, we are filled with joy that it has reached to these children. And Pratham Books, I think one very big platform we have is the Story Weaver. And I think it's also because, as you were saying, this is a big thing of how to reach out to these people who do not have access to books. And the Story Weaver is one of those, one of our attempts to be able to do that. Of course, it's digital. So, but now I think even in rural areas, sometimes we have rural areas like there's no electricity, there's nothing. But now, I mean, people do have access, and sometimes we tend to think very small of them. And so they do have access, and we have people telling us, sharing the stories about, from their mobile phones, sharing stories with the children. And I think with these initiatives, I think it will get better. Yeah, the stories will keep going forward. Yeah.
I think everyone just needs to talk about Storyweaver to everybody. No, because it's such a great resource, and some of the stories are so fabulous, and it's very easy to access. I think the only problem with it is that those of us who are very aware of Storyweaver are often the people who, in that sense, are not your target audience.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
So like this whole Delhi government project that we've been doing, we've been talking to a lot of schools, and we're constantly telling them, have you seen Storyweaver? Can you just go look at, and one teacher got back to us saying that she teaches in an MCD school in Jasola, and she got back saying, I accessed it on my phone, and now I'm using it every day. But I just think everyone needs to go and tell 10 people every week that, look, there's Storyweaver, access it.
That's right, yeah.
There is...
Story Weaver, yeah.
There's another aspect I should mention about reach, and that is the problem with translation, especially with works in English. The government had this excellent body for translation, which has done a lot of good work over the years, but it's not pulled its weight. It's not really done the quality or the quantity of translation which should have been done. Regional politics is also to blame for this. I'll give an example, and Kanado would know. There are a lot of good works, literary works, in Nagamese, which native Assamese readers, even though we are next door and even though we share a lot of words and verbs and grammar rules, a lot of native Assamese speakers, readers have not had access to it because there are no translations. And government bodies have not really stepped in. But lately, especially in the last 2 decades, I think, we have individual publishers who have been looking for good literary works from other languages, including in English, and that has picked up a lot of this slack. So the reach is now, I think, increasing, and we have more and better translations, an area which has so far been neglected to some extent. So that's also another good news.
So there's hope.
There is.
My question is to Siddharth and Kanato. It's related to how do you write a child's voice. So it's about, I'm basically interested in what are the writerly processes that you undertake to write a child's voice, and secondly, if you ever separate your own child's voice from a character's child voice, how are you able to do it?
None of my characters are a reflection of me in any way. So I always create distinct characters which are their own people. So I spend more time working on the characters' backstories than on actually writing the book. So it begins from their birth, their, background, everything. And so I build all of it, and then I build it forward after the novel, and then I cut that little bit out, and I write a book out of it. So how do you write a child's voice? It's very tempting to insert one's own childhood experiences in it, but since I don't do it at all, since nothing that I write in fiction has anything to do with me, it's really about the character herself. So I try to, a lot of the research comes from actually talking to children, but most of it is, see, childhood is a universal experience. Certain things might change depending on class or generation and all that, but mostly the interests, the yeah, you could mainly say the interests or um, the habits, the worldviews of children are universal across time and across cultures. And it is these universal things that I pick out. And also, there is this thing which has been mostly unsaid. And it is one of the reasons why people who do not read children's books frequently misunderstand children's literature, and that is, children are not a different species, you know. They are not adults in waiting. This is not a kind of lounge where you somehow endure a few, you know, days or years of schooling or parental subjugation and then move on into the real world, and then you have agency and you pay taxes and bitch about the government. It's not like that. Children are not less sophisticated intellectually or otherwise. The only thing that is different between children and adults is also the only thing that is different between us and, you know, Pleistocene, or not, well, we weren't there in the Pleistocene period, say Stone Age humans. Not intelligence, but merely knowledge, experience, right? So we are not smarter than Stone Age humans. It's just that the accumulated knowledge of these thousands of years, we have inherited. A lot of it we have learned while growing up in that lounge. So with children also, it is not about intellectual ability or sophistication. It's merely experience and some residual knowledge. So once we understand that, we might understand how children think. And we will remember how we used to be. You know, we were not stupid when we were children. We were just learning stuff. So children of any age, any generation, any class have their own voices, their own lives. But we just need to allow them, to allow the characters, that is, to express it. That's all. It's actually not very difficult. The first and probably the most difficult thing to do is to understand that they are just versions of adults.
Which is something actually could be true for any kind of work where you're actually talking about someone other than yourself. So,
I'm sorry. I will try not to go into a rant about this, but I might. So for the longest time, when men were writing about women, the presentation of them as different species. Okay, so on the one hand, you had the misogynists, we understand their language, and on the other hand, you had the people who are compensating for it by presenting them as some kind of exotic, elevated people. It's the same process, basically, where the other is either much inferior to you or somehow semi-divine. Well, not the same, because they can't be the same. If they were, they'd be you, right?
would you like to hear from Kanato as well?
Right, so I'm more of a visual creator than a writer. So when I try to visualize things, I try to put in as much as, of course, now I can't really go back and see like how a child thinks, and I think that's as picture book makers also, and with primary with children as our primary audience, it's quite difficult. I mean, that's one thing that we also keep asking, and also I think this is one problem that we face. What do kids think about? You know, sometimes they just surprise us. Sometimes I think as adults we think so much for them already that we don't leave any room for imagination for them at all. So when I'm trying to visualize, let's say, a character or put them in, illustrate them, I try to, as much as possible, see how much wonder, the sense of inquisitiveness that I can put into it. And I try my best. I mean, it may not be the way that they would, but then try to put in as much as those elements which can spark inspiration or spark them, to think more, or just to give them that sparks of joy as they, or put elements that would make them excited. So I think those are the little things that you, as an illustrator, you put in those, and I think that's the best you can do. So that's how I approach.
My first question is, how do you look at representation of LGBTQ when it comes to children's literature? Because we have somebody like, let's say, John Oliver, who has now published a book on penguins, or Talking of Muskan, which is published by Duckbill. But like that terrain becomes so murky at times. to write something on these issues. So as publishers and writers, how do you deal with that? And second is when you're writing any book for children, ultimately these books are picked up by parents or by teachers. So what is it that you think of while writing and publishing a book like that? Do you also think of, okay, we are going to treat childhood as a construct and probably challenge the norms that are built around, you know, children's literature and childhood itself? Because ultimately parents are the ones who are going to pick it up for their kids. So yeah, these two questions.
Talking of Muskan has quite an amazing track record in terms of, I think it has been mentioned in print or as a reference pretty much once for every copy which has sold. Okay, which means it hasn't sold. It's been talked about a lot. Schools have universally, unanimously refused to have anything to do with it, including one well-known Delhi school, Noida school, where the principal was there at a session we had like this, where we were talking about difficult issues in children's books. And she was really enthusiastic about it. So then when all schools, basically everyone refused to invite Himanjali, despite schools constantly clamoring for authors to visit, we approached her and said, look, you spoke very highly of this book, why don't you invite Himanjali? She said, no, my parents would, the parents in my school would not allow this. So we get lists of books, book orders from schools. It's a large part of our sales. Muskan is never there. Himanjali's published another book very recently in January about mental health and revenge porn. I don't see it going anywhere with the schools either. For us, we love the stories. We think those books deserve to exist. And we will publish them and hope that somebody somewhere will find it and find it talks to them. Some kids, not all of them gay, but who have friends who are gay, have said that they really love reading it and in their context. The other interesting thing about Talking of Muskan is that if you've read the book, it's about two things. It's about social class and being gay. Nobody talks about the social class bit of it at all. And that is at least as important in the structure of the story as, yeah.
I'd like to just say, you know, one of the things is that, like we said, diversity is a bit of a buzzword, you know. So sometimes these themes, they become, why Muskan is written about is because this is a thing to talk about. So I think that also what is needed is books which are not necessarily about that, but they have characters who just find their way into the stories, who may be gay, you know. But it's not about that. That a kind of sort of normalizing of that, which I feel, for example, in Snip, when you have a universal story of children experimenting with how to cut their hair, but the kids that you're seeing are not North Indian Punjabi kids in Delhi, I think that, you know, that approach, so that it's not always that every book has to be about the issue, but that you create room for those. And maybe it's not also a main character, you know, but that they find their way into the stories in some way. I feel that's important. Yeah? Anyone?
Except that occasionally that becomes a bit programmatic, okay? Because we actually edited one gay couple out of a book because we were very happy they were there, but we also felt that they had been put in for representation. So then it becomes a very tricky thing that is, I mean, it's with everything to do with where you're, you know, trying to put in people who are not mainstream, as she said, not Delhi Punjabi. So it's like, because as soon as you get into tokenism, it doesn't work. It's just one, and again, there is really no right or wrong rule about it. It's just when you read the thing, does it feel right, which is very hard to quantify.